Little things, yeah. Louder, hè? Chime.
Yeah, was there something for you? Yeah, because not be able. I want to. Not the illusion one. Here, because I hear you. I mean, that's maybe a character, but as somebody who is basically thinking about the authority of stay by the word, not do stuff like that. And that's an interesting question because it's not entirely clear if this contributes. So how long should the discussion be now?
At least half an hour.
Really? And the other guy still has time for his talk afterwards?
We go a little bit into lunch.
All right. Okay. No. Just throw it all away. Ja, also ihr könnt die haben, aber es liegen auch 1000 Sachen auf meiner Webseite. Also zum Beispiel auch solche Vorträge oder es gibt auch Open Access Papers oder so. Ich weiß nicht, aus welcher Richtung kommst du? Bist du auch ein Wissenschaftler am Ende oder so? Ja, also es gibt, was vielleicht das Beste ist, es gibt in Deutschland so ein Buch, das heißt der Evo-Tunnel. Ja, das heißt, naja, da weißt du ja alles. Also da ist aber 2014 eine wesentlich erweiterte Version von gekommen. Da ist sogar ein Bild von Krishnamurti hinten drin. Also vielleicht hast du nur die alte Version. Ja.
So we're gonna start, and so we have about half an hour of questions, and then we have the next speaker. Maybe we have to go a little bit into lunch, or do some of the questions after lunch for the second speaker. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is this on? Are you on? Or it's on. Let me do something unusual. Start with a question myself. I'll tell you what is an important question for me. So as you have noticed, the initiative of Jaap and Patik, we're trying to build a bridge between the teachings and what is going on in the present discussion, not only science, but cognitive science and philosophy of mind. And the last two talks have been an attempt to do a service to you in that direction. But it is not entirely clear at all if that's a good idea. And that's something I would really want. You don't think it is. I would also that I also professionally do things like that. But if we look at the things we're really interested in, the teachings, is it helpful to enrich our explorations with some of or some refined conceptual terminology to maybe say things more clearly? Or is it not necessary? I mean, one possibility is that for what is important, liberation or whatever, the classical words, the texts of K we have, are enough for anybody who is serious about that kind of enterprise, and you just simply do not need anything else. I think that's a live possibility, and that things like Anil presented yesterday or I presented are just a distraction, and then you see these new data and stuff, and you think, oh wow, that's crazy, and or what does it add? Should science also show there's really no such thing as a self? Does it add something meaningful for that kind of endeavor, the thing we're really interested in? Or to come back to the first point where we had the first subliminal conflict in this group, if somebody comes along and says, okay, talks about illusion, but from a logical point of view, that's not really optimal because that includes somebody who has that illusion, the homunculus fallacy with the little man in the head. We would rather need a theory of a selfless illusion, an illusion that is just there but not even observed by any entity. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Why?
No, I'm saying the question is helpful. The question that you're posing.
Yeah.
My take on that is that there are two different fields. This is the field of knowledge, and what Krishnamurti is talking about is the field of wisdom, how to come upon wisdom. And both are important in their own place, but the one doesn't lead to the other.
You sound like the most arrogant and conservative German philosophers in my own country that I really hate, because they would say things like that until 50 years ago. There was no philosophy. They would down at philosophy from that perspective and say, we are interested in advancing knowledge. These folks are this is just wisdom. This is India now. You seem to be saying the same thing. I thought that was a very rude Eurocentric perspective.
So, I think my environment gives me data.
Yeah.
My environment gives me data. That might be what I see right now, what you speak, what he speaks, and it's up. It doesn't work, I think. And it's up for me to take this data and to inquire on it.
All right.
And to see truth in it through inquiry. And it doesn't matter if it is a talk during lunch or it is a scientific presentation. It is the inquiry that needs to take place that matters for me. This is why I find it helpful, because
Scientific form of inquiry would be part of an inquiry in the wider sense.
the angle to inquire.
Okay.
Okay. Here's what I'm taking away from your presentation. I spend a lot of my time working using your words or your language on my psychological self model, and call it my ego. And what I'm doing is making it non-transparent to myself. And the way I find that it becomes conscious to me is when I lose control. I'm in a marriage, and my marriage isn't working well. My wife says that she wants to leave. I lose control, and I suffer.
Yes.
Why? Because my psychological self-model is no longer in consonance with reality.
Yeah.
So the question I would leave you with is the insights that you've provided to us. how can I use that to get more clear about my psychological self model, to notice how it's been constructed, since I was a baby, and how it has been conditioned, and how I run my life based upon control, and having that psychological self model come in as an intervention with other people.
Yeah.
Essentially, I believe I'm controlling the psychological self model, protecting it, and that to me is consonant with Krishnamurti's teaching. Because
Sure.
that's what he seemed to point out, more so than the physical self model that you also spoke about.
Yeah. So maybe you just want to.
Thanks for that question. Why don't you pick up on that question and talk about the relationship you see, if you see one, between the so-called physical self-model and a possible, quote-unquote, psychological self-model. That might be some.
Or the ego.
Well, I was offering. I mostly talked about the bodily self-model here and bodily identification. I was offering Jaap another 20-minute talk on mind wandering and a whole level of the cognitive self-model. There are, of course, many levels of description, and I've picked out some. And the bad news may be that there is physical suffering, which is just involved in being a physical organism that has to die eventually. And then there's a level of psychological suffering that is something that can perhaps be alleviated. And that there are higher levels in the self-model that, if we had a deeper understanding, could perhaps create less suffering. And there's a lot of, scientific psychological work on that tells us what it is. I'm particularly excited about modern mathematical models of the brain that would say it's not only data that are passively coming to me. What is actually happening is that the system constantly makes top-down predictions. So what rises in the hierarchy is not sensory data from the outside, as we thought in the past, it's prediction error. So you're living in a model all the time, and that on a higher level includes predicting how your own marriage will run, trying to predict your own future emotional state. If there's high prediction error, then this will be experienced as suffering, a source of uncertainty in your life. And the bad news, of course, is if we are physical beings, a lot of this uncertainty cannot be eliminated. The question is where we can eliminate suffering. Some people psychologically eliminate suffering for a considerable time by having an adaptive delusional belief system, as I call it, or faith in some religion. And for a certain time, this way, in the long run, as we all know, it creates terrible suffering and wars and everything. But if you were to deeply faithful Christians, your wife and you, maybe that would keep your marriage solid for a longer time. That's not what we want, right? We don't want to eliminate suffering by installing false beliefs in ourselves or comfortable delusions or something like that. We have this idea, I think, and that's also what Kay was after, of self-knowledge, which is an old philosophical ideal. But I always point out, nobody ever said that self-knowledge, may it be introspective or scientific, is emotionally attractive. Most people have the feeling this will be, it'll be feel good. It'll get better and more romantic the deeper I get into it. This may not be true. There may be discoveries you didn't want to make if you carefully look into your own mind. And then you have this knowledge, and that knowledge doesn't go away. So I think an interesting question would be, can science help to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary kinds of suffering? And I will just give one example that I find exciting. A lot of evidence points to the fact that thought chains or thinking is something that goes like a dolphin, jumps in the water. A lot of it happens unconsciously, then it pops out to the surface, and then there's a conscious experience of a thought arising, or an unbidden memory or something like that. And then it will dive down, and the processing may go on below the surface, then the dolphin may jump out again. So now imagine this brain has to predict not only the external world, but what is happening in your own mind. A suddenly appearing thought is an unpredicted event. If you're sitting in meditation, thought, completely unpredicted. If you're very aware, maybe you catch the second one. But the brain needs a model, scientists say, of the. And what is the best model? I did this. This is my thought. So there may be an automatic process of attaching yourself with a self model to spontaneously occurring conscious events, which are actually completely unpredicted and a source of uncertainty also. And you try to dampen that uncertainty by inventing the thinker of thoughts and the guy who's responsible for all of this, the cognitive agent, who also with some sense of effort tries to stay on track or control the attention or something like that. I think the important thing, if that scientific story is true, is to understand is this is not your fault. This is not morally wrong. You have not made a mistake. It's like digestive movement or heartbeat. Just in a part of your body of which you have no sensory perception. You have no sensory perception of events in the brain. Not only a thought, there's a thinker. That creates psychological suffering. That is a mechanism has found in us today. I think can help me to change in my mind that if the brain dynamics is like that it always adds a little thinker, a causal force, that an agentive character that has done this. Where do we go from there?
To follow up on that, as I understand from what you told me at the break, this whole field of that
Yes.
you're speaking from is called the philosophy of cognitive science. Is that
For
right?
instance, yeah.
Okay. So from the standpoint of the philosophy of cognitive science, what would that field say about the statement, the thinker is the thought, the observer is the observed?
I cannot speak for a field, but of a separate thinker. It's part of one of the poor or in that life. Tries to tell some process that creates this model of a thinker and a thought. And if that story is true, maybe introspective attention can be refined in a way that the actual oneness of it can be seen before you onto the mechanism and then have to act it out. But yeah.
So therefore, would philosophy of cognitive science acknowledge that? Therefore, would philosophy of cognitive science acknowledge that the statement, the thinker is the thought, the observer is the observed, would it acknowledge that that is a reasonable, rational, valid, authentic insight?
Well, maybe I certainly would, but cognitive science, at least 95% of them, they are what we call in Germany.
I'm sorry, they are what?
Careerists,
Yeah.
They just want to get ahead. They are exactly not interested in a wisdom dimension, but are very ruthless self-marketing machines in academia that could help them in their career. try to have the interest to have deep experiential insight into these matters and have seriously done a lot of things, often are conceptually very confused and not very rational in which they deal with it. Long-term meditators with weird beliefs. And then you have the scientists. And when I was here, it's not about the growth of knowledge at all. It's about appearing smarter than other people. It's a macho game of intellectual superiority, mostly among guys. And it is not aimed at any form of insight, but at getting tenure or something like that. So they are super rational and conceptually very clear, have good evidence-based models of the human mind, and that wisdom dimension is completely absent in them. And that's also this building bridges thing. You have these two populations researching the human mind, and the question is, the first thing this guy, what's his name, Krishnamurti, was very diffuse folk psych. I would give you the handbook of cognition or something like this, and say
okay,
we
so
have 127 kinds of thought.
Yeah, so
Which one do you mean?
So let's leave aside all those people and just say, would you say that the field of philosophy of cognitive science, would you say that within that field, the statement the observer is the observed is consonant or consistent with the findings?
People would say, relevant. Yeah, I would say yes, but does that help? It doesn't help you if I say yes, right?
It helps. Yeah, it does. It helps.
No. Okay.
The Buddha or Jesus Christ came upon without all this knowledge. So apparently it is possible. My question is, if you look at philosophy professors, they know all about what the Buddha said, Jesus Christ said, or everything that has been written by other people about that.
Oh, you're getting
and so
closer,
on.
yeah.
Yes, but they don't have that order in consciousness, which Socrates talked about, and which comes from self-knowledge. Now, self-knowledge is really not knowledge, but it is at the level of perception. So, my question is, can knowledge lead to perception? Or do you want me to define perception?
This will be a long story. I mean, modern theories tell that previous knowledge shapes perception. Perception is actually the best hypothesis which you have. You don't see the flowers, but you see the best hypothesis the brain currently has about what the next sensory input will be. It's just a prediction of the next perception.
Yes, but that's
but
a perception of a
let me
physical
please make
object.
one point about how you started. The mirror image of spirituality and science is intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
None of us knows who the Buddha was, where he was, if it was one person, what he really said. No one of us knows who Christ was. The first notes are 40 years after its death.
Yes.
Imagine no videos, no audio recordings of K, all witnesses gone, 40 years. It's not yet, after his death, people would write down what K said for the first time. And then 2,000 years later, people would make theories about what people wrote down 40 years after his death in the absence of video and audio recordings. We have no idea. We have no idea what states of consciousness, if both of them really existed, they are in, what they really said, if it was wrong or right. We are absolutely alone.
Yes, but we know, for example, that Mandela came out of prison 27 years in prison against the white man. Now, the professors do that?
No, I have
Answer
a lot
is
of
no,
bitterness
no,
against
no.
the
So
white
you
man.
yourself gave the answer no. So science is part of philosophy. To freedom. It's not part of the religious quest in that sense. Yet, as knowledge, it is very important. All our modern life today is changed by knowledge. So I am saying each is important in its own field, but the one doesn't lead to the other. The wisdom doesn't give you the knowledge, and the knowledge doesn't give you the wisdom. That's what I meant.
Right?
I would question whether there's no relation with that. It seems to me that the question that the wisdom philosophy is, who am I? I mean, that's a very basic question, and we're talking about the self. And it seems to me that what you're saying is shedding a lot of light on the way that the self is perceived, the perceived self, and addiction at all. It seems to me that the use of it is the snake in the rope. A rope, and there is a perceived snake, and that avatar, essentially, the less divisive in that observation.
Right. Snake in front of us. It's our situation. Will it help if scientists 10 times stays the same? Because theory changes, the deep structure of conscious experience. Cross-fertilize each other, both fields of inquiry.
Hello, good morning. On interesting ownership. And it's so interesting that self grabs ownership. And I was thinking about that there's no pain if the horse leaves, but there's pain if my horse leaves, or my money's gone, or my woman left. Then there's pain, but if it's just, there's no uncomfortability. And also what I was thinking about was with the knowledge, like this gentleman said, ultimately through all this knowledge and through all this intellect, I'm trying to get to this place of freedom. But as you were speaking, that self that we're talking about doesn't appear that it can get me out. It's only in the absence of it, not through understanding of it, that I get that freedom.
Of course. The shocking discovery is that you are this process of creating ownership through control. So there is nothing you can do, period. There is nothing you can do. And then as soon as you realize it, all kinds of clever defense strategies come up. Some people start to teach. Some people can explain it in a very clever way. They talk about myself and the mechanism of control. That creates suffering. That's a nice way of perpetuating it. And I wonder that nobody says that approaching the thing in a theoretical or philosophical way is just one other avoidance strategy. By kicking it upstairs, and keep on generating theoretical knowledge, by preserving the mechanism, which you are. But if I understand Kay right, there's in a very literal sense, there's nothing we can do, because we are that process. All right?
I've been waiting for the mic, and a lot of what I've been thinking about, I think, has been possibly covered. But I was concerned in this question of bridging, and I'm very glad you brought that up, because Kay says in one of his diary moods, "You are just a bundle of memories," and if I'm a bundle of memories, controlled by my conditioning, that is one kind of human dilemma. But as I heard it, these descriptions that you've been giving are equally deterministic. There is, in a sense, no exit. And as the cry for freedom is one of the deepest urges in human beings, possibly the deepest, I wonder how you would address the question of existentially and
story. I would say one of the absolutely hard to swallow and emotionally hurting truths is that probably on the physical level one version of determinism is true. The processes in our brains that generate all that, the conscious self and so far, on that level they are deterministic. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think quantum phenomena play no role at 37 degrees of body temperature. But we are also highly complex systems, and a very complex deterministic system can have degrees of autonomy, degrees of flexible and context-sensitive self-control, for instance, in its own inner workings. And that is also what has to do with perhaps alleviating psychological suffering or freeing oneself from it. It is well conceivable that even a physically determined system reaches a very high degree of mental autonomy, in the sense that it has veto control. For some things it can just simply stop, and it doesn't need to act them out. And this doesn't only include physical behaviors, but mental behaviors also. Unintentional, involuntary mental behaviors, neurotic thought, daydreaming, and stuff like that. So maybe even for systems like us, embodied physical systems, there are degrees of flexibility, autonomy, sensitivity increased. And maybe increasing these degrees of autonomy is what you meant by, minimizing psychological suffering.
So would you say that that has a potentially relative, it's a potentially relative cure for suffering, or a way of treating suffering, or a way of alleviating suffering, whereas what Krishnamurti is talking about is total freedom from suffering. There's a difference, but
yeah, what would total freedom mean? Well, it could mean, if you want to get serious about it, could mean non-existence. Non-existence is a state in which you are free of suffering. And there's also nobody there that will suffer from the fact that there is no happiness anymore. Do you want to go that route? I mean, it's an old route, antinatalism.
I'm just going by what he says, for this bridging the two things.
Yeah, maybe there is a way, there is total freedom with total de-identification. If there is a unit of identification, as I've said, maybe there is a way of either dissolving that unit of identification for good, so nobody is attached to that biological organism anymore, or there's a way to maximize the unit of identification, which means to identify with the nature of seeing itself, not with the object and the subject, but with the overall process of conscious experience as such. But I think if one takes in the scientific perspective, becomes swallows, because total freedom would then still be total freedom for mortal beings. And okay.
I'm just trying to understand what Kay has been saying about thinker, thought, observer, and observed. All the researches which we do in other areas, including this, who is doing it? Is thinker doing it?
No, it's vain, attached, clever scientists want to rise in eminence hierarchy and so forth.
Right, I'm trying to just relate to what Krishnamurti is saying, separate from the Causal researches. Which entity is doing in light of what
answer could be the knowing self, the epistemic progress. Not individual brains and individual researchers, but scientific communities that move through time. Sorry? Not. No, it's more like the history of mankind or the history of ideas. You know, we all stand in long traditions and pass on the torch, as it were, and at any point in time there is a scientific community with so many members. Ones die, but there's a large, you know, the human process of trying to gain theoretical knowledge. But the question is, of course, by what motives that is actually driven and where it leads to. Yes.
Going back to the talk that you gave, see, I'm concerned about the use of the word phenomenology and all that. As we understand. Sorry? Yeah. Can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah. So the word phenomenology actually is a very interesting word, and I think, as you know probably, I mean, you since you work in Germany, Heidegger established a tremendous importance in that. But I think even more than Heidegger, Krishnamurti was able to eviscerate so much of the phenomena that is internally, hidden. For example, the nature of thought, the nature of contradiction, and all that. So I was wondering, why do I have to go through these models? What do I learn from these models? One important aspect of phenomenology is I can look and learn. I can observe myself and move. Why should I go through these models?
Okay,
that is not clear to me.
I will tell you. The one sentence answer is because 1 century of scientific neuropsychology has shown us that when looking into our own minds, we can make unnoticed errors. There are all kinds of self-deception in trying to explore our own minds, of which we are completely unaware. We have so much for it. There's this phenomenological tradition, it's a tradition in philosophy, and the main idea, which is actually very close to what Kay said, was to get to the phenomena themselves, like to take conscious experience seriously, like if you have the conscious experience of these flowers here, subtract the existence. Don't think about if there's really flowers there or not, but just very carefully understand the deep phenomenal structure of the experience itself. Phenomenologists also call that bracketing. No world anymore, but just the contents of consciousness. To get and invest in a direct way is that today we know gazillion cases where you can just noticing it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. As if I don't learn about self-deception, what am I learning about? You see?
Yes, but that's it.
I mean, this could be a self-deception.
Yes.
Because the modern world has established such an it perennially. Heidegger was remarkable, but with K we have a tremendous insight into the nature of thought, to the nature of contradiction. Without my coming in contact with that within myself, with observation, I don't know if there's going to be any action in my life.
Well, one interesting point, you're actually bringing up an interesting point. I think scientific research can guide introspective awareness. And self-deception, modern research on self-deception is a good example. So I use self-deceived. I'm never. This is a transparent state. But then I learn, I don't know the precise statistics, but 70% of all American car drivers think that they are better than average car drivers. And it cannot be true. And then you research the group who have already had 4 self-caused accidents. And they still all think they're better than average car drivers. And you learn that from science, that many people, say how often, if you ask them how often do you throw wrong trash, when recycling, secretly throw it into the yellow bag, although it's not the right bag. And you say, never, I don't know. And then you ask them, your neighbor, what do you think, if you had to guess, how many times they do that? And then they say 25% they throw wrong stuff into the yellow recycling bag. And then you count their own bag. And it's exactly 25%. So they have their self-knowledge in the model of another person. You can find out what they know about themselves. And science shows these things. And then you can suddenly, you hear something like that, statistics of self-deception, and you can see, do I actually think I'm a better than average car driver? I don't know about you, but I think I am, I do mindfulness meditation, So science can actually guide that process of discovering something you were unaware of in yourself.
Thomas, I think this heavy concretization kind of that science does, I think it's very crucial, but it's important to understand in order to have an insight into it. First you have to taste it in order to have an insight into it. Mm-hmm. So Krishnamurti in his book Ending of Time talks how the mistake, this virtual reality that is perceptual created, is a part of the order of the universe. Because if we don't, and I really think this fabrication called phenomenal world was not even due to tradition and philosophies and thought. It is much older. It's really part of the mystery of the universe. Universe threw up this phenomenal world in order to have a point of reference and some kind of jumping board into the other, but not dismissing the phenomenal world. While we are still in phenomenal world, that we have draft of the infinity. Yeah. Also, can you say something about that?
Yeah, super romantic. I would, if I could be part of this story, that would really raise my self-esteem and do a lot about my psychological suffering. The mechanism of identification always tries to escape its knowledge of, and would be me as a tool.
But I don't mean greater, I mean something other that is not the thought.
Yeah, but do you know this? The question is, in this whole process of inquiry, theory, science, philosophy may not play a big role. But one thing is, we don't want to fool ourselves. We don't want to commit unnoticed errors or slip into unnoticed illusions. And that's the question. I mean, the question still remains, how do we know that we know something there and that we're not fooling ourselves? And I think that model you just proposed, it's very beautiful. It's a beautiful metaphysical model, but we just don't know that that is the case, or do we? Yeah.
So I see that thank you. I see that you're all talking of the same thing. There are a lot of people very staunch Krishnamurtiites, and you're a very good scientist. But I think the commonality of both of you is the power of observation in the moment. And whoever does that, whether they do it in their philosophical street, they won't do the whole, the avatar now, in the moment, and being good observationalists of the reality of the moment. And in that way, I think you're all talking of the same thing. You will discover. It was so exciting there in the world. Obviously, Muti would have been just as excited hearing you because he didn't know there was that possibility. So we somehow want to get stuck in a place. We've seen something and we don't want to. And tomorrow maybe you will go even beyond your own experiments. You will think that was archaic. So we should be able to see the beauty of what's possible. Did it out. Through that projection out, what about the return to heal the different parts of the body?
Yeah.
This is such a phenomenal
This will happen. Well, thank you very much. I think very briefly what unites the two enterprises, whatever it is, the spiritual search or however you want to call it, and the scientific endeavor is that you need a capacity of being honest to yourself. In science, that's everything is up to criticism and to rational discussion. And being in the present moment, you can only do that if you are honest enough. It's not something you can fake because nobody else is watching anyway, to see all the ugly content also that comes up and to look at it. So I think that is the bridge, a commitment to really wanting to know and to trying to be honest to yourself. And maybe one last concluding remark. I mean, I think a staunch Krishnamurtiite, this is really a terrible term. I just want to point out that I don't know if it has ever occurred to you, but Jesus was no Christian. Buddha was no Buddhist. And Kay certainly was not a staunch Krishnamurtiite. You know, I just make those things.
So we hope you're ready for the next speaker. And that's Pete. He's getting his jacket on, so it will look good. What we really were looking for when we put together this conference, where I very strongly felt that the person who discussed this topic about the self-consciousness a lot with Krishnamurti was David Bohm. And as we know, David Bohm is no longer with us, so I was looking for somebody who could represent David Bohm's view in this meeting. And I called up Lee Nichols, of course, who's the most well-known one on David Bohm, and he recommended Pete to do this, to bring in Bohm into this meeting. And of course we have David Moody also here, which I think is also important because he just finished I think a fantastic book on the relationship between Krishnamurti and Bohm, which was I only received after we already organized everything. So, but it's great that he's participating here, and so Bohm is here despite being here. And just to say a little bit more, Pete initially worked to postgraduate level for 15 years. This included the 2-year period at Brockwood, while he began working on his book, The Order of Thought, which will be published early autumn this year. So, good. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. So no pressure then. Just representing David Bohm, so no pressure. All right. And very quickly, I've got good news and bad news for you. The bad news is I changed my talk last night. The good news is I've done a presentation, and quickly to Thomas, I'm looking for some sympathy because they've asked me to talk after you and without a break, so that's going to be quite interesting. It's not an easy act to follow. I think that was extraordinary. You must have been wondering about this, and I hope you have been. Stonehenge and why on earth it's there, and I'm going to talk here. And in education, there is this idea that before you start talking to students, you should get their interest up a little bit.
You need to put your microphone a little lower in the shirt. It catches your voice. It's not catching your voice.
We'll sort it out. I hope that will work. I also have something going on in my throat, so if you bear with me. Yeah, I've got it. I've got my own. That's great. So can we have a show of hands of how many of you know what this is the picture of? And how many of you have been there? Can you tell me what's a bit strange about this picture if you've actually been there? Apart from the color, that's good. What else is strange about this? Well, there is that. I tell you quickly so we don't waste too much time. You don't see any people there. When you actually go there, the place is packed. You know, there's thousands of people. The other thing you can't see, it's now a little bit different, that this looks ever so beautiful and romantic. It used to be a very busy road. And if you only have pictures, you think, wow, nature, nothing else. Then when you turn up, all the cars are going by. It's slightly disappointing. But I want to make another point here, apart from the fact that appearances can be deceptive, and I'm going to come to talk about appearances a little. And I to the UK, things in the UK that you need to. There were the members of staff walking around with their walkie-talkies. And I was quite young, and I kind of thought, here I am, I want to get a bit closer. And they had a perimeter there, you weren't allowed to enter. So I said to this member of staff, can I go and touch the stones and just be in the middle? And he looked at me quite sternly, and he said, no, you can't do that. And I thought, I wasn't very happy about it. And I said, well, you know, I mean, why not? I mean, you know, it's been there for a long time. Why can't we go and do that? And so this gentleman said, people are not allowed to go. Barack Obama went there. He was allowed to get into the middle. But because we have to preserve this. And, you know, for future generations. And this was the time when I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where planets are made, destroyed, and you can go to the restaurant at the end of the universe and watch it disappear, and then you can do that several nights over. And quickly I was working out in my head how many millions of people it would take over how many thousands of years of damaging these things by touching them. And I thought, that's surely fine. He said, no, absolutely. I see him reaching towards his wall here. I was very disappointed. I didn't know what to say, a bit upset. I said, it's funny that we should do something we don't understand. And that was Stonehenge. And village, the bad bit that I'm coming on. Oh, it did work. So here's another picture. You probably recognize this. I wanted to put this picture, and all this happened last night, is because I think in some sense we're in a similar situation to this, you know, the story about the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues. And I think we're somewhat in that situation even here, but generally, that we all tend to use words slightly differently. So we're discussing the self at this conference. Everybody tends to use the word differently. And so there's this bit of confusion about what we're talking about. So some of the things I will say to you, you'll probably hear something completely different than what I actually mean. And then later on, hopefully, we'll be able to iron that out. But here's another thing I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to do here, and this will be interesting, is I'm going to say a little bit more, that not only that from one paradigm now, and there were some key people, they had interesting thinking, they posed some a few hundred to properly unfold, then we ended up with a completely different right now, which further complicates things for us in terms of what we're talking about. And I think Thomas just mentioned this. We're trying to build a bridge in so many different ways between a more religious vocabulary and a more scientific vocabulary. But also we're trying to build a bridge, I think, between these two paradigms. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a minute. Very quickly, and for me it's good, I'm talking, but it's going to be slightly less technical than Thomas's presentation. Ways of looking at the self. I quickly wanted to flag up 3 existing ways that we have when we look at the self. And the first one would be that we say that the self is an indivisible thing. I guess this is close to the Christian idea of the soul. The self is something that's indivisible. Somebody mentioned yesterday about the word individual, meaning that you can't divide it. The second option is that we say that the self is made up of things. It's put together. So there you could think about I and me, that strange division that we often try to get our heads around. Where does I end and me begin? But also we say that the self is made up of my experiences, so that it would be made up of things. And then the third option, which you've heard about now, is that in fact there is no self. So these are, I'd like to think these are pretty much the main categories. The self is an indivisible thing, it's made up of other things, or there is no such thing. And I want to go into some of that. And it's a very silly side. Actually, I found an American version of this, but I went with this one. Keep calm, there's a paradigm shift going on. I if you don't mind staying longer. Oh, okay. I'll try that. Come back to me in a. This notion, I think we do need to be patient with each other when we express ideas from whatever angle, and just bear in mind that we have this difficulty. But more specifically about paradigms, and I'm going to make this statement, and afterwards you can tear it apart or me over it. We haven't talked about educational. I want to it would be right and possible to say that one day in the future, people things, they post some radical changes happen. I think, and probably there are going to be some questions. And also, the self, the thing. I will then do. I want, and process. As we talk about, it's something able to come back to the notion of suffering and try to find a way around that. So I've got an interesting picture that I found. The self as a thing, I'd like to suggest, and I think a lot of people would go with me on that, is that it's a fundamentally fragmentary view. And I just want to quickly explain that word fragmentation with that picture. So the idea here is that you can take a whole or something and take it apart very carefully with the right tools, and then you end up with parts. And then afterwards, if you want to put it back together, you're able to do that, and you end up with the thing that you have. Another way of taking things apart, here's the picture, is to smash it all up. I'm going to smash up that clock. You end up with bits, and never build this thing back together. So the idea of fragmentation, we end up with bits that we find very, very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to bring them back together. I'm going to suggest that I think the general sense of self that we had for a long time is such a thing. It's the result of fragmentation, and this is why we're struggling afterwards to try to make the self whole. That was kind of Freudian. I nearly said the hell whole, but right. Before I talk about this, I wanted to bring somebody else in because I think it's the difficulty of the meeting point of paradigms. Whitehead, the philosopher, people might have heard of him or mentioned him. Of this idea of that the world is made up of things. And in a way that was very difficult to understand, and that he spent a long time trying to say of looking at things. He flagged up, and I'm actually relying a lot. It's a good and simple location. There's a thing over there. He's actually in touch. And then philosophers, and Thomas is looking at me, I'm thinking he's the professional. I'm hoping you'll correct me if not. A long-standing issue has been in philosophy about the qualities of these things. How do these qualities come to be there? What makes them stay there? And what really change them means. If things are supposed to be things that exist in isolation, they've got their inherent qualities, what are we talking about when we're talking about change? And this debate, the way I understand it, goes back to the Greeks and probably before. Another thing that comes from this view of that the world is made up of things is this question about how can there be causal relationship. And I am not a physicist, but I understand that in standard theory, I think which is the latest take, they're now talking about force carrier particles. So that the way things interact with each other, this mysterious interaction of forces, now they've even put a particle in there, but now there are force carrying particles, and I can't quite get my head around it, how that explains the original question. Another thing that comes about here, though, is that if things exist in complete isolation, how can we actually learn about them? How can we find out about their true nature? There is the difficulty. If I'm trying to learn about this over here, or if I'm trying to learn about some other thing, if I can't make contact with them, is my knowledge... Coming back to the making it a little bit more... There are many things that as a result of this notion that this is the thing. One way to look at it, we all live in two worlds. there is me and my subjective world that only exists because I exist, and then there's the world out there that exists absolutely independent of me. This came into esoteric thought as well. People who are interested in Ouspensky, it starts out one of his books that there are two things that we can take as a fact, the existence of me and the existence of the world, and everything else is the unknown. What also happens because of this notion of the self as an individual thing somehow is that the current models of individuality we have are acultural. This is, the self is defined, even the individual is defined in opposition to culture. So it's not contrary to what Krishnamurti says, and in fact I would argue that he offers a new model of individuality. I do this in my book. Krishnamurti says you are the world, there's no fundamental division, but the existing models that we have and educational systems are built on this. Our models are acultural. You've got the rational model. You become an individual by gathering knowledge and being able to control the world. Or there's the inherent qualities. And for example, the qualities that are already inherent. Another division that exists or comes about, you could argue because of this in more detail, that there is the observer psychological time. I perhaps mentioned it briefly. I'm just going to check on time when I'm talking about time. David Bohm, I'm going to very quickly walk you through this because I think it's very fascinating and interesting. At one point, David Bohm brought it out in a conversation that our general everyday notion or understanding of time is fundamentally incoherent. It's absolutely paradoxical, but we don't have to explain this. That normally we think of as a line. Past, before, there is the now, and then there is the future. And so how about five exists? And there's the future that doesn't. And then when we say, no, it's gone, it's the past no longer exists. How about 5 minutes from now? It doesn't exist yet. Then how about 5 seconds ago? 5 seconds from now? You go through this, and then Bohm came back and said, look, isn't that then strange? We end up with this idea that the now becomes a moment into another non-existence. And despite that, here we are. So that's an interesting. So there are not many things of psychological time. Bohm's point was that it's an incoherent way of looking at some actuality there. Another division that comes about, and I'm going to relate this to the question of I and me, is this division between the unlimited and the limited. That's also related to what I would say is a fragmentary view of the self. So let's try to unravel this a little bit and go into this. Does anybody recognize the black box on top? Talking about human behavior. The behavior is successful and popular for some time. Well, we don't have to concern ourselves with anything about it. The whole idea of conditioning, Pavlov, it came back. There was that people see things differently, respond differently to stimulus. So there had to be some kind of an explanation. This is the 90s. How many of you know him? He was slightly controversial. What he did in his in the machine, a higher something similar, and he was trying very desperately to argue against the behaviorist program. He didn't actually quite pull it off by his own admission. But what he did, and the red lines that I put in there, by the way, they're supposed to be representing rather fundamental divisions initially, and I will explain them because of some of the things that were already mentioned earlier. So instead of saying that it's a matter of simple input and simple output, Kessler suggested that we talk about, and of course he was referring to a lot of science at the time, that we've got a perceptual hierarchy. So the information that comes in, it comes in through a travels, it would get filtered, add to the apex. Flows in, comes to me, or make some kind of a decision, and then the decision through a series of triggers. So Kessler would say, when he picks up a cup, he's got that intention to pick it up, he's able to perceive it, he filters, he focuses on the cup, but it was triggered first of all. So there's this movement through hierarchies, triggering and filtering. The problem that he ran into is the apex. Where does this process of filtering information, the observer or the controller or the decider? Where is that point and where is that transition? I'll go to the next slide to make more sense of this. Is choices based on think I'm so doing something, so I decided to do something. Even compute, there is of course the computer model of what might be going on here, and then I act. The problem that Kessler ran into, this is how he started realizing that he started looking at in fact learning. How do we learn to do things? And he ended up saying that learning is essentially the establishment of conditioned reflexes. So the area that I put into a darker area, the whole thing becomes rather reflexive. When you learn to drive a car, Kessler said that essentially what you have to do is that you have to establish reflexes so that you're able to then look at the road and you know what to do with your hands, your legs, how to coordinate, all this. So what he ended up talking about, he said, well, so far so good, and this would be a very good argument in front of life. We need to be. What actually happens is that we end up not just with simple skills, but we end up with things like basic assumptions and emotional attitudes. And once we have those, our behavior becomes rather automatic. And what Kessler was trying to do, because of the behavior, is he tried to move away from this idea that we are machines. And he started to say that, no, human beings are not just machines. We're not just reflex automatons. But he ran into trouble. He didn't quite know where to go with this, because, and I of the conference, it's interesting to make this distinction between the observer and the observed, because technically speaking, you could say that the area that gets conditioned would be, of course, the observed. So my particular basic assumptions about people, about life, the point of it, or emotional attitudes. I put them as two separate things, but of course I would say they're interconnected. All of these things are the me, the observed, my skills, my thoughts, my reactions, my feelings. But somehow there's supposed to be this unconditioned I that is free to make choices. We all tend to believe that we're free to make choices. Nobody think of themselves as I'm just a robot. But then of course, to mention in his talk, if we're trying to, one of the things he ended up saying was that the apex forever recedes. As we're trying to get to the apex, it's never quite there. So what can we do about that? He talked about the rigor mortis of habit. That our lives, that the older we grow, it becomes more and more habitual, and we become more and more repetitive. Just before I came over from England, I heard it on the radio that apparently young people tend to vote for the Labour Party, and it's about the age of 34 that people automatically become conservatives. Apparently it's just like that. So Kessler was still trying to argue his points, and he said men, and I put that man, of course it should be men and women. So human beings are not like machines, but they can certainly become like machines. So he ran into that. His only solution was, in fact he had a very bad solution. He thought that mass medication would be the answer to humanity's ills. I explained what this is. Recently, as I think of intelligence, and he was a computer scientist who then became intelligent machines. But he came up with an idea which thought and the apex. Instead, he ended up with this idea that there isn't a central controller or processor in the brain, and of course we now know that we're probably never going to find one, but he said that the entire neocortex works as a memory system. And I explained the significance of this. As a computer scientist, the difficulty was that how do we get computers who are able to compute fast enough information to be able to do things? And the struggle he explained was that build a robot that sits, but can you build a robot that can sit into any different place, or the computing power that would be required for this? So this really, really puzzled him. He even went into things like, he makes these very interesting comparisons. He talks about neurons and their ability to reset themselves, and to be able to then receive a new signal and then output a response. And he said that neurons are able to do this 200 times a second. I think that figure is right. So he says this means that this is the computing speed of the brain. The point he makes, and that was in 2004, that modern computers, by that, we're able to do this, I think, 50 million times faster. So he said, why is it that we've got computers that are just millions of times faster than this so-called computer here, but we're still able to do things that computers can't? So this puzzled him. He went on a whole journey, ended up writing a book about it. The solution that he came to about this problem was simply this. He ended up suggesting that the brain does not compute answers. It retrieves them from memory. So he said, everything we're able to do, the whole neocortex is a memory system. There isn't computing, but what we do, everything is retrained from memory. He then explained that for that reason, memory will have to have certain features or aspects that actually are not similar to computers. But ever since then, I think he's doing extremely well, and he's trying to put this theory into practice. But his idea was that there isn't an apex, but that the entire neocortex, and I'm going to explain a little bit more why that is significant, is a memory system. And his image was, it's not my idea, it's his, the waterbed. He said that when we respond to some kind of a stimulus, he said it's the same way as when you sit on a waterbed. There is no computing going on. The waterbed does not compute how it needs to readjust itself as somebody sits on it. But it's the whole material structure, and in fact the totality of it, which is significant, determines the response. So we can come back to it later on. So and the paradox. It was called the problem and the paradox. And the point he made there is that oftentimes in life we think that we're dealing with a problem, when in actual fact we are confronted by a paradox. And he flagged up that it's very important to realize if we're dealing with a paradox, for the simple reason that paradox has got no solution. We will forever try to be solving it. And I just feel that this, I will agree in a minute that of course is not there, and trying to do things with the self is essentially a paradoxical thing. This is why we can't solve it. We're trying to solve a paradox when we're trying to do things with the self, when the self tries to become enlightened or everlasting and so on and so on. The problem can't be solved because there's something paradoxical underneath it. But I'm also, I just mentioned this by this fact that neurons, and of course they went in there, if you like, to try to discover, you know, what makes us human and how we're able to do the things that we do. And I put it down at the bottom that thinking, operating its rational scientific best, can't explain its origins. We can't do it. You know, thinking goes in there. It's doing its best to be rational, sane, scientific, and the whole thing of it, which is very important. But we're still back at the beginning. We can't explain the origin of thinking necessarily. So this was very big for the first part when I was talking about the self as a thing, and I was saying that it's a rather problematic thing to treat the self as a thing. And of course people then moved on from here, and we've got the idea that to talk about the self as a process, and I'm going to go into that. I won't have time to bring out the connection with Bohm's implicit order. So those of you that are familiar with Bohm, of course the implicit order features quite significantly in his thinking. The one thing I'd like to emphasize, the difference between these two ways of looking. So looking at the self as a thing, or looking at it as a process, I would argue that the fundamental difference, and this goes back to the idea of a paradigm shift, is that in this view, you start from wholeness and you do not fragment that wholeness, but that you're trying to account for everything, in inverted commas, and I'm going to explain that why in a minute, as fundamentally part of an undivided whole. So this is really the point here. So how do we get some kind of a sense of this relatively quickly? Bohm's suggestion was that we think of the totality as a stream, as a flowing stream. And he would say that in this flowing stream, which is the totality, forms appear, so vortices appear. And he said, these we may abstract as things, so you can see that there's a thing on top. It looks like that, we would say that. But what Bohm was emphasizing is that this is fundamentally not dependent of the totality and the total flow. It has no independent existence. In the whole idea of thinkhood, things have their independent existence somehow. So that was one of the points. And he, for example, he would suggest that the entire material universe is an eddy in the stream of totality. He would say that consciousness is also just a form in this stream. I put in there all is flux because, of course, this idea is not new at all. Again, it goes back to the Greeks, and probably even before, they had this idea. There was already this debate was waging then, and we're still at it. They were saying they had the idea that all is flux, that what is just this movement, everything is moving, changing all the time. Another important element of this, which is not obvious here, I haven't put it on there actually, is that Whitehead, who is of course sometimes thought of as the father of process philosophy, at least the modern version of it, he was saying that the difference between, again, these two ways of looking is that the first one emphasizes the unchanging nature of things, whereas the second one, the emphasis is put on change, that everything is constantly changing, everything is constantly moving. So from one point of view, you try to explain that if everything is unchanging, how do we account for change? In this point of view, say everything is changing, how do we account for stability, at least relative stability of forms, right? That's an interesting part of it. So, again, this goes a little bit back to the previous talk. So, if we were to look at the self not as a thing, as a process, how do we start getting our heads around that? So, Bohm offered the analogy of a rainbow, and he would suggest that we all have seen rainbows. When you look at the rainbow and I suddenly spot it and I point and say, look, there's a rainbow there, you will also look and you will say, yes, there's a rainbow there. We're sort of in agreement here that there's this beautiful thing up in the sky. Of course, it's not there. Let alone that the sky is also not there. It looks very nice and blue, isn't it? A beautiful blue sky today, but that sky is also not there. So we've got this issue of appearance. And so Bohm made this comment that we've got an appearance and it's coherent for me to say to you, look, isn't that beautiful? And you look at it, that's so far so good. But then if I say to you, there's the pot of gold, I'll be back in a bit. I just need to run off and grab it. Bohm said that's fundamental because that's when I will run into incoherence. And so I will come back to this point. The idea about the thought God is this. Bohm made this comment that earlier times people couldn't account for the phenomenon of the weather. People had no idea, primitive times. So they had this notion it must be gods doing it up there. And there was this invisible God responsible for lightning or whatever it was. Bohm said similarly, we seem to have invented the thought God. Because we've got all this stuff happening and we say, well, it must come from I, the thought God, right? That's the idea. And why not? I sometimes make this statement, again, how we've got this historical development of our understanding of the world. We think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, right? Because of their belief in dogma and superstition and, rationality and reason wasn't around at the time. I wonder if sometime in the future this age is going to be called the psychological Dark Ages, because we had these rather strange ideas about things around. So I think it's an interesting comparison to make. Now, so far so good with the image of the rainbow. This is fairly easy to comprehend. What, again, I got fairly enthusiastic about reading various books is that in the field of what we might call the biology of consciousness and neuroscience, I found something that was very, very similar to this idea. And I'm going to talk about the self appearing at a confluence of processes. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book by Antonio Damasio, The Feeling of What Happens. And again, he was trying to create some kind of a coherent notion of the self. I hope I'm not misrepresenting him. I think by his own admission, he hasn't quite made it in his book. I think after he wrote this book, he was actually fairly well received and popular. He later on said that he himself was dissatisfied, I think, with his account, and then he wrote another book. I have to admit, I haven't read that one. Come back to the point. Damasio effectively suggests something very, very similar. He says that the sense of self appears at the confluence, the coming together of various biological processes. And as he develops this argument, he ends up speaking about the proto-self, the core self, and the autobiographical self. And he does explain that these are evolutionary systems, if you like, that appeared. So first would have been the systems that now give rise to what he calls the proto-self. These are very sort of fundamental aspects of the biological organism. Then there's the next level of devices, as he calls them, which then working together with the proto-self, give rise to the core self. And the autobiographical self, here's the bit exciting for me, is connected with the neocortex. Because Damasio would put it that our sense of self, that this is who I am, this is my background, this is where I come from, that's my room over there, and everything else has to do with autobiographical memory. So that if for whatever reason you take that away, my consciousness, my sense of self is going to be rather different. So the idea there is that the autobiographical self precisely requires the movement of memory, thought, knowledge, if I now come to Krishnamurti's and Bohm's vocabulary. And only when these processes come together, that's when we end up with the appearance of a rainbow, of that sense of self that we normally are quite familiar with. But the question for me is this, that I think is very important to look at. Are we saying that the self, as we are familiar with it, or as the way we sort of understand it, is it a real process, or is it only just an appearance? And I think it's very fundamental to make that distinction, and if we don't do that, we run into trouble. So there are these processes that come together, similarly with the rainbow. Various processes are coming together. There is the light, there are the falling raindrops, there is then the observer or the observing apparatus. You can take a picture. And when those processes are together, there is the appearance of the rainbow. So similarly, but it's not that. The rainbow is not a thing. We can't go and try to change it. It's not coherent to try to do that. What if it's exactly the same thing with our sense of self? That it's an appearance that is dependent on these other processes, but it's not a real thing. And I think it comes back to this notion that there is no self, right? It comes back to that, basically. The reason why I think it's important to bear in mind that distinction, that the self, because we all say I have one, or people tend to say that anyway, it's an appearance, but it's not a real thing or another real process, is the following. There's this massive question of coherent and incoherent appearances, and Bohm would speak about this. And he would give various ideas, and I think one of the examples he gave is that if that table here was a very, very good hologram, so apparently it's a table and I try to put my cup on it, it would fall through and it would break. So immediately I would have some kind of a feedback that the appearance was incorrect in a way. It sort of, it confused me. So there is that feedback. I act on it and immediately there's a feedback that I have to look again. And in fact, in that vein, Bohm was flagging up this issue that we're always dealing with the appearance and the essence. So looking at that table, he would say that essentially that table doesn't look to me like a circle, because I'm standing here, it looks like an ellipse. But because of experience, I know that it's actually circular. So there's the appearance and the essence. The appearance says that that is elliptical, but it's not. It's actually a circle. But here's the next thing. Going deeper down, and of course Bohm was a physicist, he would say that apparently it's solid, but of course physics comes in and says that there is no solid. There are atoms in there. It's massive amounts of empty space, so that solid thing is actually not there. And then Bohm says then we can go even deeper, because we might think that the atoms are the essence, but he says even the atoms are appearances, because they're further divisible, and you can carry on like this. So I quickly mentioned this is in part the idea of the implicate order, that Bohm said that the implicate order is infinite and it's unknowable. And out of that we abstract explicate orders which are apparently independent and apparently exist, but they're actually abstractions from that underlying totality, right? So the essence, here's an interesting similarity here, the essence forever recedes. We never come to the infinite ground of being, if you wanted to put it into that language. We're always dealing with appearances. And because of this, it's very important that we remember this, and then we realize that when something is going wrong, we need to generate another perspective, another appearance. The reason why I say that is that Bohm also pointed out that the way we get some kind of an understanding is that we get different views, different appearances, and when we're able to combine them into a coherent whole, our understanding increases. Another thing that happens is that if we attach the wrong meaning to an appearance, this is when we run into incoherent action. So if I think that the rainbow is real and I try to act on it, I try to secure it, I want it to be there always, right? If I act on that wrong meaning attached to the rainbow, I'm going to have a lot of incoherent actions flowing out. The result of that will be conflict and suffering. And I also put in there is that the self as a reflexive movement of habit. This is this question of the question of appearance, whether I've got free will or not sort of comes into it, but maybe when we come to the questions. Very quickly, we've been asked to tackle this question, the function of this whole thing. So what's the function of the self? And by now, of course, I have to say that the self is, as far as I'm concerned, is only an appearance in the movement of consciousness, or in fact in the movement of thought, of reflexive memory. What does it do, right? going back to Hawkins, you had this idea about the neocortex being a hierarchical temporary memory system. He, of course, came to this idea of prediction, which I think Thomas mentioned it, and it's been around, that what the brain does, or what knowledge does, that it's constantly predicting. One of the things that apparently puzzled Hawkins was this, I didn't know about this beforehand, that we always think about information flowing into the brain and then action flowing out. And he said that apparently there's a great deal more information flowing outwards, still in the perceptual hierarchy, than flowing inwards. And he said, why is that? So he developed this idea that the brain is constantly predicting what it is seeing, and it's measuring up. Am I getting this right? Am I getting this wrong? So, but his whole idea, where I don't particularly agree with his take on intelligence, is that he said what the neocortex does, this memory system, is it's constantly predicting. Disables a lot of things, this helps with a lot of things. That's what it does. I am personally not quite sure if we can say that the self and consciousness and this ability to predict and everything that has come about necessarily means, without questions, an evolutionary advantage. So when people argue that point that it's there, so there's a reason for it, so it must be an evolutionary advantage, I'm also thinking that this whole ability for us to predict and do things, it also brought about a lot of conflict and trouble. And if we look at the state of the world, there's a great deal of incoherence going on. Now, why is that? So this evolutionary argument, for me, is still a little bit open. And yes, what if it's just the rainbow, the self? But what's interesting is that Krishnamurti flagged up this point of, I think the way he said it was that consciousness is active when there is conflict. Normally, we've got the automatic system running and it's doing its thing, and we're unaware of it. You're probably all familiar with this idea of, or this experience. In fact, I'm not even sure if you can call that coherently that, driving a car. And suddenly you realize on a familiar road that you're about 5 minutes down the road from where you should have been, and you've just done it. It was the habitual, the automatic. So what happens there? So the same way as the apex forever recedes, it's interesting for me that Krishnamurti says that this sense of being there and being present comes up when the automatic system is not able to resolve things and deal with things. Then suddenly we have this, what Kessler called subjective experience of being. And I'm coming to the end of what I'm trying to say. So my emphasis has been on this notion of if we treat the self as a real thing that exists independently of everything else, or a real process that has independent existence, we're going to run into problems. And a thing that comes about, and I perhaps haven't done it justice because it would take a bit of explanation, is that one possibility that comes about here, when you look at the this notion of that the neocortex predicts, is that effectively the sense, I don't even like to use that phrase, the sense of self. The self is a prediction. There's all this stuff going on in the neocortex, and the system constantly is predicting, and it just hit upon this prediction that I have a center. And that prediction has come about, and it was probably useful to your point, but the system is just now carrying on, constantly predicting in terms of there being a center. It's almost as if it somehow learned to put a rainbow always up, so when it wakes up, whatever it does, it always sticks a rainbow onto the scene as well. It's become a habit. It's become a habit to generate and refer everything back to the self, because it somehow makes sense. And I would say it makes sense in certain areas, but in other areas I think it causes havoc. A few more points to make. If we go not with this idea of the self as a thing or as a real independent process, but if we say that our cosmology or our way of looking at the world is going to be coming from wholeness, and it's that everything sort of forms a whole, that all is flux, trying to introduce a fixed self into this will inevitably run into trouble. I don't know if that's clear. If everything is always moving and changing, but if I want to maintain myself as it's always been, there will inevitably be conflict, because everything is changing all the time. In relationship, people might say to each other, you didn't used to be like that. Why are you that? I'm upset about the way you are now. You didn't used to be like that. But of course, everybody should be constantly changing, perhaps. So I think what's happening is that the whole system, it constantly wants to have this fixed entity there because it makes sense to your point, and maybe it's pleasurable, maybe it makes for security. I think this is all our conflicts and suffering is a result of this ultimately trying to always bring the self into everything, perhaps. And so then the question, it comes back to me is that, and this was my starting point with Stonehenge, maybe it's a bit of a long stretch from there, but have we been trying to protect, nourish, learn about, modify, extend something that isn't actually there, that has got no continuity, and there's more that could be brought out about that, that has no inherent qualities, because it's simply an appearance, right? And also it just appears as an image in this reflexive movement. Is this what we've been trying to do all along? So, finally, again, quickly, just to tackle this question of freedom from the self, because Yap's program, it was part of it, say something about that. What would that mean? So, satellite navigation, right? We all have one or we use one. None of us know how it works. It's a miracle, but it helps us really to navigate. I would say that the current order, if you like, of consciousness involves this notion of the self, right? And everything seems to be ordered on that principle. And it seems to be coherent, but it runs into difficulties. So currently, we're navigating life as individuals. I'm hesitant to say that because we're not. Based on this particular order, this order of idea that there is I, there is me, my thoughts, and we're trying to make order. We're trying to get around based on this idea that this is the nature of consciousness, this is how it is. And I think freedom from the self could be looked at, of course there's a lot more to say about this, as freedom from this wrong meaning attached to the appearance, that it's real, that it's important, that it needs to find meaning, it needs to become happy and fulfilled, that it needs to become rational or well-adjusted to society. I think all our mistaken meanings attached to an appearance, and I think that's where we're caught. We're caught in the whole paradoxical situation that comes about as a result. So in some sense, freedom from the self would be freedom from that wrong meaning. The self appearing in itself, the rainbow appearing in the sky, is not a problem. And it comes and goes, that's also not a problem. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Incidentally, the word happy is related to chance. It may or may not happen. You know, happiness shouldn't have to be an ultimate goal. So that, I think, one way of looking at the freedom from the self very, very quickly. And that's it from me, I think, for now. Sorry, Steve.
So, Peter, are you ready for some questions?
As ready as I'll ever be.
And because of time, what we can do, we can take some of the questions now, and then some of the questions after the break when we start again.
Sure.
Yeah?
Anything is fine.
It's not, well, that's loud. It's not really a question, but something that I wondered from the last discussion into here is that many of the questions that seem to be coming up, freedom from self and all these questions that we have or I have, I won't know those until I get to the end of self. That's where the answer's at. The answer to all the questions are at the freedom from the self. I have to be free of the self. That's where the answer to those questions, it would appear, would be at the very end of that. Do you have any comments on that?
I hope I see what you mean. But in some sense, you seem to be suggesting a process of I am now here, and I've got all these questions about the self, but I will only know the answers once I've ended the self, right? So the question is, and I think it's quite familiar from Krishnamurti, is there some kind of a process involved in that, right? Because normally we would think that, well, what do I have to do? How do I go through the steps here to then come to that point, and then it will happen. In some ways, involved in, if you like, the idea of the implicit order, or that way of looking, coming from wholeness, this problem becomes something that is rather different. But it's a little bit difficult. You would have to spend some time going into this. That how do things change with that time, right? This is what we're talking about. And I don't want to use the word the illusion. You know, I mean, how does one drop an illusion? What does that take? Now, one way to look at that would be that what that takes is an immediate contact with the fact, right? So, and this is when time becomes a difficulty. So I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but the idea would be that this whole movement of conditioning and everything else negates contact with the fact, whatever the fact might be, right? But only that contact with the fact would be able to end the illusion. I don't like using the word illusion so much. So I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense to you, but the way I heard your question would be related to that point. Does that make sense? Right.
Thank you, Peter. And as I'm sure you're aware, Bohm used the term proprioception. He talked about the faculty of our physical body to be aware of itself proprioceptively, but that thought lacks the feature of awareness of its own movement. And in the book Thought as a System, he raises the question, is it possible for thought to become proprioceptive? And I just wonder if you could comment briefly, we could draw this theme out for us a little bit. What is the relationship between proprioception of thought and the sense of self? And do you think it's possible for thought to become proprioceptive?
The problem I have when you ask that question is that I've got sort of a long chapter on this, and to try to condense that into something is difficult. Going back to this idea of perceptual and motor hierarchies, so Kajtar suggested this notion that this idea that we're not actually dealing with hierarchies, but we're dealing with holarchies. And the point he was trying to make, holarchies, and he invented the word, and he put his hand up and said, I know it's not a good idea to just invent words, but I want to. In fact, the word holon, he then explains that it comes from two words, hol, meaning a whole, and on, meaning a particle. So photon, neuron, apparently that bit on means a part. So he wanted to create one word that signifies that everything is both a whole and a part at the same time. So he talked about holons, these are units, everything is a holon, and holons then form holarchies, was the idea. Thinking about the human body, you could say that the heart would be a holon in the overall organism, the lung would be a holon, or lungs rather, two holons, but it becomes difficult. But that holons themselves are holarchically organized inwardly, and this can be extended in both directions. So everything is a whole and a part. Now, if you develop, and if you look at his way of thinking, what he started discussing about, for example, what makes a whole and a holon, and he would say that it's the function of a particular thing. So what makes the heart what it is its function. This will involve both its structure, external structure, and what it does, but also the way it relates to everything else. Is that clear? That the ideas here, and I will come back to proprioception, I haven't forgotten that, but there's a reason why I have to explain all of this, is, for example, he would say that there's an internal coherence to the heart, what it needs to do with the stuff that comes into it, if you like. But there's a ruled governed behavior. There are some fixed rules and flexible strategies. I'm working up to homeostasis, incidentally. It's the same idea, ultimately. So there are some internal rules in a holon, but there are also rules how the holon need to be related to everything else externally. So there's internal coherence, canons of a holon, and there's also external coherence, the way it sort of fits and has to relate with everything else for a harmonious operation. What he then suggested that ultimately, in a holarchy, whatever you consider, there is what he called ruled governed behavior. And this idea of a ruled governed behavior, from that point of view, is effectively the same thing as homeostasis in a biological system which we're familiar with. Keeping the blood, I think the acidity has to be the same, temperature and everything else. That is a ruled governed behavior. The system looks after itself. So proprioception and what Bohm sort of flagged up, proprioception is one part of the homeostatic regulation. So it does come into it. But for me, and I know it will not be immediately obvious what I'm suggesting to you as an answer, that proprioception is one part of something that is already there, right? There is this rule-governed behavior in the system of thought happening even, which part of that includes, by the way, project the self. Let's become now rule of the system. Always do this. There is already regulation involved in that. There's already a sensitivity involved in what's happening. So this, I put it, but like I said, it's a longer exposition. Proprioception that Bohm talks about, for me, is part of a bigger theme of rule-governed behavior. So, and your question was about, can thought become proprioceptive? To me, that I would translate, can it become its own rule-governed behavior? I'm not sure that the answer lies in that direction. Does that make sense? That I understand that a lot of people say this about, oh, Bohm flagged this up about proprioception. I sometimes wonder if that was part of his thinking process and his creative exploration that he mentioned that. And there was a specific time when he was quite keen on that. I think it's part of a bigger picture about the whole system of thought that we need to bring out. And then proprioception falls into place. That's the answer I can give for now. I hope that's not sure if that was helpful, actually, David. I'm sorry.
Two more questions and then we do lunch.
Isn't it a bit simpler then, or is this a too simplistic a model, which is that the body has proprioception. We all know when, if you're going to walk into how to avoid. So in some sense, it's an instinctive or natural capacity. As I understood proprioception when David Bohm was talking about it, was that thought itself could be similarly aware of where it's going into a wrong area. For instance, when it was creating something independent of itself, and then pretending or being deluded into thinking that this thing created by thought was an independent entity. So could there be, as it were, a sharp edge to thought which recognized that this was its proper province and this was not? In other words, it would catch itself in its own activity. That was my understanding of what he meant.
Right, so I feel like saying welcome to the Tower of Babel. It's at the Tower of Babel a little bit. I mean, I've got proprioception and awareness. I stumble there a little bit. That's one thing. That, the idea of proprioception is that I know how to touch the back of my knee without looking, and there is that intelligence, wholeness to the system of my body that enables me to do that, and proprioception is fundamental for that. If I had issues with proprioception, I probably wouldn't be able to stand here. But another thing that comes in here, which I haven't at all been able to talk about, is this idea of mind and matter and the difference between that. The reason why I say that is that one thing that Bohm was, I think, very keen, and I actually think he was rather successful in doing, is that he got rid of this division of mind and matter. In the sense that, some of you might know, he had this image, in fact, of a magnet, and he talked about the total magnetic field, and he said the north and the south pole are abstractions from that magnet. And then he would argue, and he did this in a quite detailed way, that mind and matter are abstractions from a total field, right? Now, if you consider that this might be the nature of the beast, or the nature of reality, that mind and matter are part of one thing, immediately for me, awareness becomes problematic on the one hand, because somehow I would want to come to awareness that is neither mind nor matter, and that becomes a little bit difficult. But also, in terms of proprioception, like I said to you, the word aware, couldn't thought become aware, right? And on the one hand, we recognize that thought has a material aspect, or again, aspect, I'm using it in a very technical sense, like Bohm. There is that material aspect, but what do we mean by an awareness that would become aware of that material aspect? Or are we talking about two sides of the same coin that could be there at the same time? And then, to even then explain it properly, I would have to go into this sort of hierarchical notion that what's matter on one level of a hierarchy is mind on the next level, is the subtle and the manifest, the soma and the significance. All of these things I would have to bring in to try to begin to discuss proprioception, I think, properly the way I'd like to. So. Right, I'll change my flight ticket.
It sounds as though, at least in my understanding, the whole matter of awareness is maybe somewhat slightly different. He's putting out a challenge or putting out a proposal that cannot thought, which is a material process, that's key to it, is that thought, which is a material process, not behave like the body, which knows where it is, moves around, doesn't walk into tables. This cannot thought have that quality, because obviously when it doesn't have that quality, it creates all kinds of delusions and nightmares for itself, and that is part of the psychological dilemma of human beings, that we don't catch ourselves. We don't thought does not catch itself overstepping its own limit, and that's an absolutely, fundamental error. It's not just a partial, small neighborhood thing. It's an absolutely crucial error, and if it could catch itself and be sensitive to itself, to its own mechanism, just as the body is sensitive to not walking into chairs and tables, then we would have, we would be clearing up some of the mess at least.
Right. So let me have a sort of crack at answering that from a different angle then. You could say that right now, thought thinks itself separate from the body, right? In some sense. Or thought is introducing a division in any case. It's a movement of division without a doubt. You could say that the system of thought would be one particular holon in the totality. But right now, it's a disorderly holon, would be the description of it. It is not in harmony, and it's not part of the wholeness in a way. It's constantly trying to disrupt or go against it. So, in this sense, when you say awareness, for me, awareness would almost mean holonomy. Again, I'd have to explain that. That thought now becomes a harmonious part of the totality of the body, of that particular hierarchy. No, this is...
I'm starting from something which is, I think, much simpler in a way, and is just a proposal. I think even in Bohm's terms, it was a proposal that could this happen, and if it did, would it not, clear up a lot of the mess that we're in? Because thought does not catch itself. I agree with you. Thought does not catch itself, so it builds all these castles and all these ideologies and all these.
Okay, but I think it should be final because it's 1 o'clock. So let's last one.
Professor Screw, you've got the final answer.
I think
that's good.
Yeah.
I think I can go.
No, I'm not answering. I'm just saying that it is probably a semantic problem, because when you say thought is material, right, and you say mind and matter, right, then mind has to include awareness. Only then the other statement of Krishnamurti that mind is outside the brain, whereas thought is something that is from the brain, from the memory, right? Makes sense. So perhaps you are using the word mind, awareness, and thought somewhat differently from where Steve is coming from.
Perhaps, but I wonder if there's another option here. So, and this is why the Tower of Babel, I'm being very serious about this, and this is why we've got an event like this when we have to look at it from different angles. So, this whole problem that thought is a material process, Bohm and Krishnamurti discuss it back and forth. Well, and Bohm says, what do you really mean by that? The difficulty is that where I wouldn't like to go is to introduce a division yet again. And so I would say that thought as a process, where you say material, I would say that it's a repetitive process. It has got a subtle and a manifest part. And I would suggest that we could look at it this way, that what we say is our experience is the subtle part of thought, and then the material activity in the brain is the material part of thought, but it's one movement, right? So this is this interesting way of trying to look at it from a point of view where we're not introducing so awareness, this is precisely the point that it would be something slightly different. Awareness is a quality of the whole without division. So, well, this is the whole point. let me put it this way. We've got this dichotomy normally of the mind and the brain, and then we agonize over their relationship, and this is the old Cartesian dualism of how. What if we don't allow that division right from the beginning, and we say that mind and the brain, the two sides of the same coin? For me, awareness would be found in their wholeness. That awareness would be an aspect, or when you're able to consider them whole. So coming back to, very quickly, this notion of thought and what it does and its movement, it is because it's not integrated properly that it is not it, that there is no awareness of itself, or that there isn't that whole awareness of its proper role and place in the totality of the organism. And I understand, Steve, that it sounds like a very convoluted way of going about it. It's just I'm fishing for a vocabulary that might shed a different light on this. Because to say, can thought become proprioceptive, it could completely throw me back. So like, how does thought acquire that quality? What is really that quality? What do you mean by proprioception? And I'm just trying, I think, to come to that same question that you're raising with a different vocabulary. And of course, naturally, the difficulty is that I'm probably stuck in my own words and my own ways of putting it. And that's when we have to find a way of...
So couldn't we follow that up then after the break?
Sure, that's great.
And that gives also some chance maybe to discuss. And
yes, very good. Perfect.
And take some more questions. And
Sure,
we can start
after
with
lunch, that is.
After lunch, yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you for the pointer. Sort of helped. Great. These are